welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Stephanie Fisher. I'm a rare disease patient advocate and serve on the Pennsylvania Rare Disease Advisory Council. I am thrilled for really any opportunity to talk to Luke Rosen and Dr. Wendy Chung. I have trouble thinking of any two people who I admire more in the rare disease community. So I'll do a quick intro and then we can dive right in. And you are welcome to ask questions. We definitely want to leave some time to hear what's on your mind that maybe we haven't addressed yet. Dr. Chung, and I have to look at my notes because it's very impressive and I don't want to leave anything out. She's a clinical and molecular geneticist and a Kennedy Family Professor of Pediatrics and Medicine and Director of Clinical Genetics. You can find our full bio on the side. She leads the Precision Medicine Resource in the Irving Institute at Columbia University. She's authored over 500 peer-reviewed papers and 75 reviews and chapters in medical texts. She also was a recipient of the 2019 Rare Impact Award from the National Organization for Rare Disorders. And having been fortunate enough to see Dr. Chung engage with patients and families at the KIF1A and Project 8P family conferences, I can tell you that this is way more than a job or a career to her. It's a mission and a passion, and I think that'll come through as we speak today. Our other panelist is Luke Rosen. He and his wife Sally founded KIF1A.org, and he's currently the chair of the board. He is a VP of Accelerated Development and Community Engagement at Ovid Therapeutics. And there he brings his passion for drug development, and also he leverages his personal experience to make it as easy as possible for patients and families to participate in the clinical trials that are necessary to bring new treatments to those patients. But of all of his titles, the very most important to Luke is dad. He has two children, including Suze, who lives with KIF1A associated neurological disorder, and that really drives his passion for the community and for the organization. I also wanted to note, Luke received the 2018 Rare Impact Award from Global Genes, so really so excited to talk to both of them. And I also wanted to mention, in case you haven't seen it, both Dr. Chung and Luke are featured in the Gene documentary by Ken Burns, which premiered on PBS last year. So if you hadn't had a chance to check it out, I highly recommend it. We should all be staying in anyway. So if you need an excuse for a movie night, there you go. Luke and Dr. Chung, do you want to say anything before we dive in?
No, I'm just so privileged to be here and to be able to share part of rare disease with everyone who's in the audience. So I just can't thank you enough for having me today.
Yeah, me too. And I think, Stephanie, just to add, at any time, it was very flattering about, the Global Genes Award and everything. I always think of, instead of it was me, it was really our whole community. I was just a loud voice yelling. So it really was all of the KIF1A families. That's just representing them. But you're right, and Susanna.
One of the things I love about Luke is he doesn't focus only on his community, as passionate as he is, but he usually finds some way to give a shout out to another organization. So I'm just going to call your attention to his hat.
Yes, if you guys have, this is two disabled dudes, my friend Kyle Bryant and Sean, a really incredible podcast. So if you get a chance, go on and wherever you listen to your podcast, listen to two disabled dudes. It's fantastic, and they give shouts out to every community, but KIF1A, of course, too. So check it out.
Awesome. So since our topic is teaming up on single gene diseases, Dr. Chung, could you please start off? Well, just giving a quick overview of what monogenetic rare diseases are.
Sure. So monogenic rare diseases, we're just going to break it out by the different words. So mono means one, and genic means gene. So these are conditions that we think of as being single genes, as opposed to there are some other conditions where it's more complicated. It's probably multiple genes, or it's something environmental with the gene. So let me give you some examples to break this down. So when we think about cystic fibrosis, just as an example, cystic fibrosis is caused by one gene, the CFTR gene, And people who have that are unified as a community because there's one gene and it makes the diagnosis and it clearly defines who does and who doesn't have cystic fibrosis. As another sort of other end of the spectrum, if you will, take asthma. So people who have trouble in terms of breathing and need bronchodilators. Asthma has a genetic component, but it's certainly not one gene that goes into that. And it's probably not just genes for most people, but it's things that might be related to dust or allergens or air pollution or other things that also sort of irritate the lungs and make it hard to breathe. And so we distinguish those two. Rare Disease Day is wonderful to me because it's not focusing on just one rare disease, right? But it's bringing us all together. And as many of us often say, although these conditions might be individually rare, they're collectively common. And so it's really joining the forces in terms of raising awareness for all of these conditions together. So as an example, some of the conditions that are monogenic might be 1 in 1,000 in terms of the more common ones. Even some might be 1 in 500 for the most common ones, but some of the rarest ones are 1 in a million, literally, in terms of large, rarity for them. So depending on exactly which condition it is, the other thing that factors into this is that most of them are underdiagnosed. And I want to underscore that because that's incredibly important to us in the rare disease space, is that there are certainly many more people who have these conditions than who realize they have the conditions. And specifically for genetics, in large part, that's because you need some fancy genetic testing to make the diagnosis. And not everyone has had access to that, or, the technology wasn't available when they were getting their genetic testing. So indubitably, we're not nearly as rare as we might look at.
And I was wondering, could you mention some of the single gene, some of the other diseases that you work on at the Chung Lab, that you and your team?
Yeah, sure. So Luke knows a lot of these very well, but I'm just very pleased, Stephanie, that I get to put a shout out, and I apologize because I'm sure I won't remember every single one. But we study a lot of neurogenetic conditions specifically. So neuro meaning related to the brain, and genes. So KIF1A or CAND is one of the ones, but we also study other conditions. And my families always tell me, I feel like I'm in Star Wars. It feels like you're saying R2-D2 and C3PO, because it's a gobbledygook of letters and numbers, but they're important to each of the groups. So I'm going to shout out a few of them, even though if it sounds like R2-D2 and C3PO, but there's HNR and PH2 and PPP2R5D and DDX3X. And, we could go on and on in terms of those different letters and numbers that go together. But collectively, I also have a program that's called Simon Searchlight that takes together many of the genes, actually about 160 of the genes and copy number variants that predispose to autism, not exclusively autism, but increase that risk. And so we've, rallied all of those together to have some of that economy of scale. I mentioned that sort of being collectively more common. We also study several other conditions, I have to say, and as much as Luke said, really I shouldn't be the one up here talking, but it's simply easier to get me on than 100 people who work with me. But we have a lot of people who work on everything from certain types of congenital anomalies, so birth defects that babies are born with, whether it's structural problems with the heart, so congenital heart disease or diaphragmatic hernia or esophageal atresia or cleft of the lip, all of those types of conditions. We also are fortunate, have actually for about 20 years been working on pulmonary hypertension, which is a really rare condition, but we realize also has genetic underpinnings for that. And I had mentioned autism as well as epilepsy and intellectual disabilities, those things as well. And then I also study some hereditary forms of cancer, specifically breast cancer. And so all of those, I guess the other point that I'll make is that I don't think I appreciated this 20 years ago when we started studying some of these conditions, but there are connections that we've appreciated over time in which these are not isolated conditions, but some of the same genes that we study for one condition end up being the same genes that are involved in other conditions. We're just, as people sometimes say, we're kind of like the blind person looking, feeling an elephant. One person's feeling the trunk, one person's feeling the tail, and all of a sudden we come in and meet each other in the middle and realize we're studying the same elephant. So in the rare disease community, I think we've suffered sometimes from not having everyone sort of come together and look at the whole of the person, but study their individual piece.
That actually leads really well into the next question, and I am mixing them up a little bit just because of the way the conversation has gone. How can nonprofit groups build relationships with physicians, clinicians, and researchers? And I don't know, Luke, your story, Luke has a wonderful blog post, which should be listed as a resource. It's on the kif1a.org website about riding the elevator about his first meeting with Dr. Chung. I don't know if, I think it says a lot about building a relationship, even just starting with the two of you, if you'd like to just share. And then if you want to take first crack at that question, and then we can turn to Dr. Chung.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Stephanie. That's a great question. I think the first part is, you know, I got really good at asking for help. It's like my best skill set, right? Is asking people for help. And after we were Sally's my wife, and I were very, of course, confused and incredibly scared. We made our way to, but we lived in Harlem at the time, so Columbia. Both our kids were born at Columbia, and if I fell down and needed stitches, we went to Columbia. So Columbia was our place, and we were very lucky in that we ended up, after we had this very complicated and difficult, like Dr. Chung just said, group of letters and then numbers specific to Susanna. After those, enigmatic letters, we went back to Dr. Google and found a few terrifying results and papers, and we were given this confusing piece of paper, and somebody was kind enough to say, you really do need to connect with Dr. Chung. And so we reached out and asked for Dr. Chung's help, and within minutes she was kind enough to respond and invite Sally and I to come to her office so she could explain the implications of what Susanna's diagnosis really meant to us. And I recognize that we are incredibly lucky. I want to say that. And this topic of collaborating to find a treatment is something that we're right in the middle of. We certainly haven't done it yet. We don't have treatment yet, but we're all putting our shoulders behind it to get there, and we're making progress. But back to your point about the very beginning, is we're so fortunate because I've since met a lot of people in our community and in the broader community who don't have the support nearly as much as we do. And I in the story you were talking about, it was there are two things that really I always think about, and it was as we were sitting there, Sally and I, and when the elevator door opened on the way up at 7 a.m, and we were met by a genetic counselor, a social worker, a nurse practitioner, and then Dr. Chung. We had this wall of support, and didn't feel we felt like we were going to be it was a safe place, in a very unknown outcome. And I remember as we were sitting there, and there was a lot of Sally and I where there was a lot of crying in the room and listening to what might be our future, and how our everything was changing in that moment. And I remember thinking, and this is the part that always, forgive me if you've heard me say this before, but it's the part that always hits me in the stomach hard, and is as we're sitting there listening, I was thinking, I blurted out, well, how do we tell Nat? How do we tell Susanna's brother about this? And Dr. Chung looked me right in the eyes and said, he's going to grow up to be a remarkable human being. And that was exactly what I needed to hear in that moment. And it was this reassuring sort of, everything will, that there's something that is for certain. And what is for certain is that the people involved, while our lives change, there's something remarkable about that change that will hopefully result in treatment for the kids. But the other part of that moment was knowing that it wasn't over. That it wasn't over at that meeting. It was sorry, there's something popped on the screen. It wasn't over at that meeting. It was once the appointment was over, Dr. Chung walked us out and got in the elevator with us and took us down all the way out to a cab. So I am just amazingly lucky and close with my wife, Sally. I can't imagine. I mean, my hat is off to any single parent who is going through this, because I couldn't imagine that. But I still have trouble imagining what that elevator ride down would have been like after having received this news. So it really, when I think about that day, I think about having somebody who was not going anywhere and who took the elevator with us. So that was a little bit about that story. Thanks for pointing that out. I'm forever grateful.
Well, Dr. Chung, hopefully someone has told her she's never allowed to retire, because what she does is so important. Do you want to comment all on how to build a relationship for other folks who want to, because you've done such an amazing job, Luke, in motivating your community and really fully engaging with Dr. Chung and her team?
So thanks, Stephanie, for the question. I've actually been thinking about this a lot because for some of you who may not be able to see the gray hairs in there are some gray hairs at this point, and in a good way. I've thought of sort of what I've done and where we're going and how we can use that experience. And so Luke actually said this. I don't know that he meant to say this, but it's true, which is that I've been at Columbia for basically 25 years. I've actually been stuck there. I don't know exactly why. I guess I like New York and I like Columbia. So, but by doing that, one of the things that it's allowed me to do is really build these very deep roots with the community. And at the beginning, it was literally with the community. So it was people in the tri-state area, and that's been, I think, incredibly important because it just built this trust, this sense of dependability and trustworthiness, so that people in the city always knew they could count on me. They knew that they could send a patient, or if they knew they had a family member or friend, and it's sort of just organically grown in terms of those relationships. It's a friend of a friend of a friend, but still, if you come and you say, Wendy, someone needs help, I'm always there. And then what happened with social media and with the internet and Facebook and everything else is it just became, instead of being geographically defined, it then became defined by people who knew each other, but because they knew each other from being in the genetics community in a good way, but in an explosive way, it just kind of exploded to being worldwide. And so, in the same way, it becomes the same thing in terms of a friend from someone who could be in Poland or in Ireland or in Australia, and it's just sort of has grown like that. But in a good way, or let me just explain what I was saying originally. It really begins with this trust and earned trust. So what I mean by that is someone asks you to do something and you do it, and you do a job and you do it well and you follow through, and you're dependable and you fill a need and you're there when people need you to be there. And then it just kind of grows from that in terms of people realizing if you can do a little thing, maybe you can do a slightly bigger thing and a slightly bigger thing. And, it grows from there. So it's not as if it's just like overnight you go from, someone saying, yeah, let me partner with you and work with you. It's something that really is a relationship, that evolves over a long period of time. And I see that again and again and again. And so, one of the things that I've been fortunate to do is, well, let me step back a second. So there's some conditions that even though they're monogenic, we've known about them for a long, long time. And so they've had very well organized patient communities because, we've known about sickle cell disease or we've known about Huntington's disease for decades. And so those are really well established group. They have incredible leadership. I will just, take my hat off to some specific ones. I mentioned CF before, but the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, I think, has been incredible in terms of how they've taught all of us about how to have a really engaged community. And some of the questions we may get into, I look to them really for leadership in terms of teaching me how to do that originally. But some of the things that I really like are actually the very first patient that I diagnose. And so, I can count the dozens of times this has happened, but when we started from the very first patient on the face of the earth recognized to have a condition, and then growing to a community of, at this point, it's still, less than 1,000, but in some cases, hundreds of individuals that have the same condition. And being there to, start at the beginning and be transparent about, but you have to realize when we're an N of one, we know very, very little, and we're pretty honest about that. But, how we grow and share and learn. And I think one of the things that we're learning from each other is how to do that on scale. So again, as I said, and I think it's really critical for the rare disease community, I mean, these are expensive things we're talking about needing to do for clinical trial readiness to get to the point of new therapies. And so we've got to sort of learn from each other. What did you build that we can clone? What did you figure out that we can apply in our way? If you had discussions with the FDA, how much of that applies to what we're doing? There's so many ways that we can share that information. And this is just one example, but it's so impressive how the rare disease community has come together even more so over the last 5 years to be able to appreciate that and be so generous in terms of sharing that experience and that infrastructure, in some cases very expensive infrastructure.
I think of, I have worked with a few other patient groups. I think in the rare disease community, there's a true appreciation of the resource of time, because there's often a clock ticking. And so that's one of the things I love about the community. People are so eager to share what they've learned. If there's any way that they can help another community save time, but even more importantly, a lot of times, or save money, but even more importantly, save time.
Yeah. I just to follow up on what Dr. Chung just said is I do think that there's it's not certainly not standard how she described her ability to be there from day one and always be supportive. Because I'll give you an example. Is Sally and I were actually so when Susanna was diagnosed, we knew she was, and I just went back and saw an email where because sometimes I forget the number, but we knew she was one of maybe 15 in the world that was identified with this. And we were at NIH staying in the children's inn at night. And one of the things that Wendy told me was that, you should try and find more families. And so we did, and I connected with a family who was, who was just diagnosed, and I emailed Wendy saying, "Do you mind if I give this person, put you in touch with this person, or give this person your information?" And the response that Wendy said is, "Luke, you can give my information to anybody who really needs help." And so to me, that was remarkable, because it wasn't call the office and talk to my assistant. It was, I'm willing to talk to anybody, any family who really needs help. And I think that doesn't exist in the world often enough. And so that's something that Dr. Chung might have forgotten to mention, that she, anybody who needs help is somebody she'll talk to. And second is I think about what rare disease. So Rare Disease Day to me is very scary and a hard day to remember. This is actually only the second time I've been able to participate in rare disease events. Last year, on this day, we were in Montreal celebrating the life of Lhasa, who's a little girl who died from complications to KIF1A, and the year before, and that was an incredible day to be able to. English is not the first language of the people who were in that community and who were there talking about Lassa's life and about the family. And it's the thing about all of the people in this whole broad community is that I didn't understand half of what the people were saying when they were talking about Lhasa, and her doctor was there talking about the last couple of days of her life, and the family was there, and it was all in French, but I knew exactly what they were saying, so it was this moment where I realized that all of our experiences together so far transcends talking and language. It's really about the love that people have for each other, and who's there when you need them most, and who's willing to say, anybody who needs help, I'll talk to. And so rare disease day for me, and the year before that, we were in the hospital with Susanna, and so we were focused on one thing, but to me, we every day is Rare Disease Day. We work so hard every day, and every minute that I'm not doing something to help, and this must get in the way of I saw a question about conflict, right? The conflict to me doesn't really exist because it's inefficient, but I'm sure that I create conflicts because any moment that I feel like I'm not doing something, I find something to do that's often probably a monkey wrench into the engine of efficiency. So I've since learned to step back, or Dr. Chung and I have enough of a shorthand where she'll say, Luke, step back. So for me, Rare Disease Day is the one day where we should take one little moment to stop and take a deep breath and look around and give everybody a big virtual hug. We should be virtually hugging all the time, but you know what I mean? And it's the one day we should stop and take a breath and just be for a second. So it's not a day to recognize Rare Disease Day. It's almost a day to take a break for 1 second, because we're 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. We're just not stopping until we find treatment for the kids. And so that's what Rare Disease Day to me is I think about Lhasa, I think about being in the hospital, I think about on all of the other families, not just in the KIF1A community, but who are going through this. So it's a moment to take a deep breath and say thank you. That's it for me.
Quick question for you, Luke, because you touched on 2 points. One was progress, and that when she was diagnosed, you were told Suze was probably one of 15 with KIF1A with CAN. How many are you up to now? Because I think that shows some progress. Really, the hard work of you and Kat and the full KIF1A.org team, but also science and getting. Certainly understand that underdiagnosis is an issue, but with genetic testing becoming more accessible. So we'd love to hear an updated number.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much. And again, I feel like you could insert wherever it says Luke or me with whole community, because it really is the leadership of our organization and people like you mentioned, Catherine Ashley, who's our president, and Shannon Scott, who's another parent and who communicates with all the families, and Dominique Lassard, who's our science, from the org, is our science helms person, and she has created an efficiency and the ability to speak with her peers and scientists in a way that I certainly can't. And all of the families, every single family quite literally has a skill set that we're utilizing and putting our collective shoulder behind. So certainly not one person. I always say that, leadership really is surrounding yourself with people who are better than you. And that's something that we've done a good job at. And so it really is the leadership of the organization. And of course, the support from Wendy's team and the people who do this. This is talk about finding the A team, and these are the people who do it, and so you got to find the people who do it. And we're lucky enough, our whole community, to have found Wendy's team, who the people who do it, and are not going to stop doing it. But we've recognized, to answer your question, 2 things. One is growing that community and advocating for genetic testing, and that we're around 300 globally right now. And we're trying to really break it down because, and Wendy can speak to the science far better than I can, but we know that each mutation, there are a lot of mutations on the gene, and they vary in severity and outcome and progression and other things. Each mutation is very specific. So for Susanna, we know there's, I don't know, around maybe 10 people who are diagnosed with this mutation. And while it's one big community with lots of similarities, there are certain pillars that cross over into every single mutation. There are certain specific challenges that different parts of our community have across the continuum of KIF1A. So it's this really strong community that is there for everybody. And then these micro communities that are able to meet up and talk about strategies and then share those strategies with the broader community. So we're understanding the overlaps and the differences and the different things we need to do as parents and caregivers to change those. So I like to say that we are one community of 300, but little community, not communities, little subsets of people trying to figure out ways to deal with everyday life that might be different than others in our community. So 300.
So I just was thinking as Dr. Chung was speaking about, meeting with that very first patient and giving them diagnosis. It's not just now you have a name for what's wrong, but then you can take the next step of finding other people. And again, to build from going to 15 to 300 and not only the research opportunities, but the support. One of the things that I learned at your conference was watching, the parents of slightly older children, younger children kind of looking to the parents of slightly older children to get an idea of what they might expect. And again, that community doesn't start to happen until, researchers, clinicians like Dr. Chung, give them that diagnosis.
Absolutely. You find your tribe and
you touched on conflicts. I don't know if we want to chat about that a minute. How can one of the suggested questions was how can conflict be effectively dealt with? I would add or avoided. So I don't know if you. I think a key component, just listening to the two of you, was when Dr. Chung talked about building trust. I think that, if you have the trust, then you give each other the benefit of the doubt. Because if Luke just sent 15 emails, what's going on in the community? Like, it's always from a good place.
For me, it's also conflict is good, right? And not conflict, but you fail hard, right? You risk. So I used to be an actor, and one of the things that we would always say in rehearsal when you're trying to figure out a scene or something, you risk, fail, risk again, right? And I think that you got to fail hard, or you got to have that conversation. That's a hard conversation to have in order to make progress. And I think that that's important. That's a point that Dominique brought up the other day. I always, before I go on a panel or something like this, I always say to the community, is there anything you guys want me to say? And that was one of them, is that conflict is good, but I also think it's inefficient in many ways. There's so much noise going on, right? There's so much drama and noise, and it becomes inefficient when you start letting that distract. So it's important to knock out all that noise and really focus on KIF1A, really focus on what we're trying to accomplish. And I think that conflict comes from that noise often, and it's inefficient. And I try to, I'm sure, like I said, I'm sure my impatience and my inability to just stay still and not try to do anything to help can create conflict, and more detrimentally, which I've learned to stop, is create inefficiencies, which is something we can't afford to do because we're running out of time. So that's what at the end of the day, if we're only thinking about the kids, throw conflict out the window. If internally with the org, if we have conflict, I always defer to whoever's topic it is. If there's conflict about how to organize and operationalize a survey, then at the end of the day, I just say, Kat, it's what the decision is yours, because this is your skill set and nobody's better at it than you. So Kat, onward. That's how I see conflict. Wendy might feel differently.
You don't have to say Luke's name. You can refer back to the many communities you've worked with over 25 years.
So I'm gonna, it'll be a slightly deeper sort of answer to this because, like you said, Stephanie, I'm going to draw from a bunch of different experiences. So I think you're fundamentally right that if you start from a place of trust and that relationship, there's a lot of stuff that you just give each other. You understand it's a bad day when someone responds in a certain way or whatever it is. But there are some places that I'll just point out because if there are families that find themselves in this situation, some pitfalls that I've seen over time, and I don't know that I have the solution for all of them. And even though everyone has the best of intentions and they're doing it for themselves or for their family from a good place, there's still some conflicts that I've seen. So let me give you some examples over this. So one of the things I know, I'll just point back to what Luke was saying. One of the things I always tell Luke is stick together, right? So the community is kind of, as he said, there are these small little chapters within the community because different individuals have different symptoms or different changes in the KIF1A gene. And I always tell Luke and Kat and Dom and everyone else, I say, you got to stick together though. You can't fracture. You can't sort of form your own little subdivisions.
Right.
You have to stand united because the strength is in numbers, and the strength when it comes to developing treatments to be able to show how many you have in the community, to be able to help each other, to be able to fundraise, to be able to do whatever we need to do organizationally. Like it's a numbers game and we've got to stick together. And I give my hat off to the leadership at KIF1A.org. They've done a tremendous job in terms of doing that. I will put a shout out to the team. And I know I've said this before, like if I ask them a question, they respond faster than any other community, literally. And I know I do this to a lot of communities. They respond faster, more completely. If I need to, put out a paper on the condition and I want to get their feedback directly in terms of something we're going to write, I can get them on the phone within 4 hours and be able to have a conversation. It's like remarkable. So that was a digression, but let me just say you guys are like awesome. But there are conflicts that come out when communities don't see eye to eye on things. And so what do I see sometimes? I see what are already small and rare disease fracture because some parents within the community have their own ideas about how things should be done, and they don't have the sort of, way diplomatically of doing things the way Luke does. They're just either personality issues, or I'll be totally honest, they're oftentimes financial issues. And so, sometimes, what'll happen is there's a family that has, in whatever way, some financial ability to drive whatever is being done, and they have their own, understandably, but their own interest and heart in terms of doing this, or they have their own sort of mindset in terms of how they want to do something, and so they'll kind of split off from the rest of the group and do their thing. And then that creates some conflict and some tension between that branch of the group and another branch of the group. And I'm not trying to, say that this is always bad. I'm going to point out to just, again, for those of you, because I learn from I stand on the shoulders of people who have come before us, right? And so I learn from all of them. So I'll give you an example where there was one of these situations, and I actually, it's sort of like capitalism. Having some competition is sometimes a good thing. So within the spinal muscular atrophy community, the SMA community, there was one very, very well-established group that supported SMA, and then there was, and I won't say any names, but there was another group who came along, and they had some resources to be able to put behind things, and so they saw themselves as, I won't say completely conflicting, but they started to occupy different spaces. One group was serving kind of the care needs of the whole community, a lot of the support, a lot of the day-to-day needs. The other one saw themselves as primarily a research arm, really down deep in the research, getting really involved in that. And I actually credit a lot of the advances that we had in SMA to the second group that came along with very, very good scientific leadership, directorship, a lot of sort of small, lean, and mean, and so could be more agile and could adapt well. And they just drove it home. And they were, I think, really smart, very good business people. They didn't financially benefit from this, but they could just think about return on investment, what were key catalysts that were necessary. And I point to that because within that period of when they got into the fields versus when we had treatment, like literally within just over a decade, we're able to get to an FDA-approved treatment. And now there are actually 3 FDA-approved treatments, including gene therapy, as well as national newborn screening for this condition that used to be past tense, used to be the most common monogenic cause of death for children less than 2 years of age. So like, a 180 in terms of what happened. And I do credit a lot to what initially you might say started as conflict, but actually ended up, I think, resolving into something that definitely did the community some good. But I watch it, and I'm going to put it out there because I think within the rare disease space, people know about this. I'm not calling it out in terms of criticizing, but right now within the Angelman syndrome space, just as an example, I think people understand there are different groups out there, and in a good way, I think people are trying to do good things. I think some of that, again, competition or conflict per se, between some different groups doing different things, I think actually is advancing the field. I think it's pushing us to go faster because there is some people doing different things and challenging each other. I'm going to put it in that way, in a friendly way. But I think because of that, we're seeing the first trials in Angelman syndrome. We had, I think, a little step back in that we had to stop the trials because there were some side effects. I'm sure they're going to iteratively get better. I think it was the first time doctors and scientists appreciated, for those of you who don't know, Angelman syndrome is another neurogenetic condition. It's a rare disease. It's a condition that's pretty impactful. And so I think people were thinking, yeah, if you start a treatment, you'll be able to make a little tiny effect, but in the treatment trial that was done with oligonucleotides, these little tiny like DNA-like molecules that get injected into the back and then travel up to the brain. There were individuals within that who went from not talking to being able to say words, something we didn't think would happen, something within a few weeks of treatment. Talking with Liz Berry Kravitz, one of the investigators who did this last week, and she was telling me about, one of the children who couldn't swim to being able to hold their breath and swim across the pool underwater with a lot of motor coordination, being able to walk much more effectively than they used to be able to do within literally weeks to months, something that for that condition, I think if you'd asked us ahead of time, we never ever would have thought that would happen. And to me, that hope for what is possible for neurological conditions, especially, that I don't think should have these I think we have to make guesses, but I think we have to be ready to be surprised that we don't know everything, and to be able to just do some of these hard studies that need to be done to get the answers that we need to move forward. So it's conflict, competition, I guess is the way I think of it, friendly competition, hopefully, in terms of doing this, but there are some difficult spaces to navigate. So let me just give you a couple other examples, and I won't spend too much time on this, but sometimes there are at universities investigators that are in the same space and they feel like they're competing with each other. I think the family groups can do an incredible job of what I call convening authority, and I know many people have done that in terms of virtual research roundtables or lab meetings, and within the Zoom space, I think have done a really good job of making people come to the table, and even pre-publication or publicly speaking about this, having investigators sort of shamed into sharing, I guess is the way I think of it, in a good way, but being able to share that information and make sure people don't waste their time on things that aren't useful, and share reagents, whether they're cells or mice or other things, just because it is the right thing to do. And so I think from one of the things I've seen really effective is the families really catalyzing that, being the ones that really are moving that. For investigators that, like I said, they I won't say mortal enemies, but they definitely were competing against each other. And in the same space, although it's a little bit more complicated, is the space between industry. And so industry, different companies is what I'm saying, that might be developing things. And I think that's a space I'm still trying to figure out completely how to navigate. So they're competing against each other. They are, some things they'll say are in the pre-competitive space. And I think we've done a good job about convening those scientists together to to be able to share what's in the pre-competitive space. But once you start getting into something that's, over that wall, then it becomes a little bit more challenging. And some things they can share, they can share things like, how do you do a good natural history study? How do you set up a good clinical trial network? I think those things they're very happy to share, but other things, it's their business. And so I think that's still something that we're trying to, I don't know, at least I feel like I'm still trying to navigate how to be able to walk that fine balance of allowing them to have a business so that they can keep developing the treatments we need, but then not keeping everything too close to their chest that they can't share things.
I agree with a lot. I think that, for us, KIF1A.org, we're a very blue collar group, right? We're very scrappy. And the examples that Wendy brought up, I think they're very well resourced organizations and very well resourced and wonderful initiatives. And so I think with those resources comes people thinking about different different agendas, maybe. I don't know, for lack of a better word. So I think that, for us, there have been a couple of times where one family will say, hey, we're in this geography, we're going to set up our own, shop. And the answer is, and a lot of this is, again, due to leadership, like with Catherine's, what Kat does is, we joke, and it's true, is that she is a velvet glove to my iron fist, right? And whereas, we'll say, well, what do you want to accomplish? What are you trying to accomplish when with your own, because it really is. There's a reason it's called KIF1A associated neurological disorder, not disorders, right? We're all together. We're one group. And so if we sit down and say, well, what are you trying to accomplish, and how can we integrate that into what we think we're trying to do, and how can we articulate it in a way that's going to get the external, all stakeholders behind it? Because if we splinter off, then everybody's going to be talking about a different, and a lot of it is centralizing where we support our research. And I think that if the community is willing to say, well, what are you trying to accomplish and how can we support you? My friend Mike Porath at the Mighty, we talk about when you pitch and you go in and try to get money from people. The first thing, he always says is, what do you need and how can I help? And I think if you go into every conversation when somebody has a different idea and you say, well, what do you need and how can I help? Then it becomes this conversation that pulls everything together. And I think when Wendy's point about, especially with industry, having to hold things close and not be able to share, it's part of the beast and it took a while for me to get around it, but I realized that if it's the people who can explain to you why something can't get shared right now that are people who you kind of trust, right? Because, it can be for instance, the public nature of the company or just whatever infrastructure exists that I don't know much about it. But if somebody can say, look, this is why we can't talk about this right now, just trust me for a minute, then, it feels a little better, but it still feels a little icky, to be honest with you. But that idea of sticking together is so important. And, I think there is some connection with resources that I can't quite make, but Wendy's point was a good one. Yeah.
This might be slightly off topic, but one of the things that I really admire, one of the initiatives of KIF1A.org that I admire is your Science Saturday. And so by providing really weekly updates on where the science is, where your efforts are, I mean, I would think that not only does that help the community come together, they know what you're working on, you're communicating. I do not have a science background, an American government major. I'm so grateful Dr. Chung breaks words down into their components so people like me, because you don't, it's not like when you get a rare disease, you automatically get a PhD. It's such a steep learning curve. And most of us didn't know that we were going to be entering this world. And so I might have paid a little bit more attention in my science classes, but I really love the effort of Science Saturday to break down, okay, what does this paper mean? What are the possible implications for our community? And if you could just, Luke, maybe talk, because I feel like this ties into the, if you keep the community united, I mean, you're explaining what you're doing in a way that anyone can understand coming from different levels of health literacy. Maybe you could just talk about what was your motivation to do that, and then you can give an extra shout out to some of the folks who worked on that, like Dom.
Yeah, and it was Alejandro, who's the father of a kid in Spain, KIF1A kid in Spain. It was really his idea was especially to bridge the language gap. I mean, some of these, publications, they're not in different languages, and so it became a way of dating everyone. And I like to call it colloquializing the science. And it's funny because colloquializing is not a word. But it's true if, you can, if you can put everything together in a way where people can understand it, then all of a sudden more people are going to be active in the community, right? And, when you have our KIF1A kids, at least I can speak for myself, Susanna, every single moment somebody needs to be with her. Every moment of her life, somebody has to be right there with her. And it needs to, so if you have a second to put a YouTube tablet in front of her and do something quickly, it needs to be in 5 minutes. It needs to be quick, right? And so if you can understand the science of the last 7 days, not just about KIF1A, but about the entire rare disease community, all of a sudden you feel educated, empowered, and ready to be part of it. So I think that, Dominique Lassard and Alejandro really, and of course, Kat driving that forward is great, because every single week, every single person in our community gets to understand in some way what has happened in the last 7 days that applies to their children and their life, and how they can actively become a part of it. Every single person in our community, all 300 ... has a skill set that is incredible. Whether it's molecular biology or event planning, or thank gosh we have John Seamer, who's a CPA, to do the numbers and keep us on track there, and his kid Lily is who brought him in here, not us going out to try to hire somebody. And it's harnessing those skill sets, and you can't do that unless you can give someone an idea of what everybody has the right to learn about their disease. Everybody, and if it's and it takes colloquializing it to really be able to reach that audience. And if sometimes the scientific and medical community have difficulty making it that accessible, I think Wendy's team does an amazing job making it accessible. And at the end of the day, if we ever have a question, we just ask. But I think having that, and also what's useful embedded into that Science Saturday, are links that link out to other organizations and other papers and other, so yeah, thanks for talking about Science Saturday. That's something that's really important. And I think that this is a broader discussion, and I'll just touch on it. And it's PJ Brooks from NIH said something recently, and it's something that really has resonated. It was also the most devastating realization of my year, was when he said it's no longer necessarily about discovery, and it's more about operations. The problem isn't discovery, it's operationalizing things. And I think that that's quite true. And COVID we see this, right? Like there are certain, and I think that if we can somehow shift our focus, not shift, but if we can somehow focus on getting people to think about rare diseases every day, like they do Rare Disease Day, maybe operations could be a little bit easier, or a little bit more urgent, and
we could probably talk
colloquializing
an
everything.
hour on this. I want to do a quick shout out. Luke is going to be on a panel tomorrow with Tracy Dixon Salazar of the Lennox-Gastaut Syndrome Foundation, talking about using health literacy to elevate the community and enhance research at Rare Disease Day at NIH. Registration is free. It's at 2:10 tomorrow, so definitely check that out. I did get a heads up. It's time to wrap up. So if you want to share if each of you want to share a closing thought or two. I could talk to the two of you for a few more hours, but we're getting the hook at 2 for another talk.
So I'll just say very briefly, I do want to just make sure everyone appreciates how hopeful I am, at least in terms of the rare disease community. There are some enabling technologies that are coming down the pike. We don't have time to talk about all of them, but they really are things that can be transformative. I mentioned, just how much that small trial of Angelman syndrome has opened my eyes, at least for neurogenetic conditions, what I think are going to be possible. And I think our job right now is to be able to be ready, to be at the starting line. I think it's just the starting line. So I'll warn you, I think we've got a race ahead of us. But I think it's incumbent upon us to be ready so that as these enabling technologies open up, we can be at the gate ready to go. And we need to be there. And whoever's there first and lined up, I will warn you, is going to be the one who's going to be first out the gate. So each of us, I think, is really important. And whether that's natural history data, being able to know who's where with what diagnosis and what symptoms, being able to be part of this in terms of the cells that we can give researchers to test these things in dishes before they test us in people, all of these things that are clinical trial readiness, now's our time to do it. I'm not saying like it's going to be July 1 that we're ready to do the clinical trials, but we need to be ready so that we don't have that gap, as Luke was talking about. I always think of the hashtag stop the clock. Like we have to multitask and we have to do 3 things simultaneously or 5 things simultaneously so we don't lose that chunk of time. So now is our time. It's the rallying cry. We're ready to go and we need to get to it.
Yeah, I mean, that's my final thought would be, yes, exactly what Dr. It's about being ready and de-risking it and teeing it up and making it impossible for somebody to say no because you've done all the work for them already. And that's our goal. And you can only do that if you're a tight-knit group and everybody's on the same page. And so it's the same mission for the same reason. And I would also say that, when I think about taking a break for a second, the thing that doesn't let me take a break is thinking about Susanna and thinking about the kids we've lost and thinking about Lassa and Gia and Cora and the Ard family and Eleonora and there are too many to mention and I'm missing them, but I think about the kids and I think about how every single day that we go without treatment is a day that we're never going to get back. And so whatever we have to do to get to that finish line as fast as possible, we have to do it. And it doesn't matter what language we're speaking or if we understand, the high level science or not. It's just as long as we're all rolling up our sleeves and pushing as fast as we can, that's how we're going to get there. And, I just want to thank everybody. And of course, Dr. Chung hears me. I hope hears us say thank you every day because we're so thankful to her and her team, but thankful to everybody for, putting a collective shoulder behind us and racing right with us because you can't do it alone. And I can say that fracturing our community is something that's not going to happen because we, rely on each other so much. And so we're lucky to have that glue that's our children. And we're all running together. So we'll get there. And Stephanie, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to put in a quick plug, and I haven't looked at the full attendee list, but if you're sitting at your computer all day instead of running to Starbucks, even a $5 donation to kif1a.org, I can tell you as someone, I'm not personally impacted. I don't have a child with a disease, but the families have my heart after attending their annual conference in 2019. This community is so motivated. Even a $5 donation to show that you support them, and they are going to make the most of every cent. They are so engaged, so willing, literally donating blood, sweat, and tears. So please, if you have a chance, visit the website. If you don't have $5, support them on social media, retweet, share, anything you can do to help spread the word. It could lead to growing that 300 community number. Luke, Dr. Chung, thank you for all you do, not only for the KIF1A community, but the broader rare community every day, not just on February 28th. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. You too. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Chung. Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Stephanie. Great conversation. Great on it. We appreciate everything that you guys have contributed. And thank you again for your participation in the 24 hours of rec.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for doing
and
this.
Jeff.
for all you do as well, and for the opportunity. And thanks for everyone watching on a Sunday.
Virtual hug.